I just feel that we're very honored to be able to have People for the American Way represented here at our state convention. And Michael Keegan is the president, and he's been a long-time board member for People for the American Way and People for the American Way Foundation. Now, Michael also has a very rich background in progressive activism, particularly in the area of LGBT. He is the founding national board member of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. He also serves on the board for the Los Angeles Public Libraries. Now, beyond that, Michael is a real estate investor and has worked in many various areas with media and the entertainment industry. Today, Michael is going to speak to us on religion, politics, and the American way. Please welcome Michael Keegan, President.
When Arlene had reached out to have somebody come from Washington, D.C. to represent us here, I said I would like to do that, and the immediate response was, but it's in Michigan in December, right? And I said, I know that. And they said, it's right before, when you're planning to be in Los Angeles, because we have our 30th anniversary celebration honoring Norman Lear and Alec Baldwin on Monday, and we have a board meeting and planning for our 2012 election plan, which is 2012 is going to be a critical year. But I thought this is actually the perfect place to be, because the work that you guys do and the work that we do has intersected for all the 30 years of People for the American Way's existence. And so it seemed only appropriate to be with you guys here instead of Los Angeles, where I think it's supposed to be 75 today. I wanted to talk about our work and our kind of vision of America, to give you a little idea about what we do and how we do it. I want to let you know that hundreds of staff and board members over the past 3 decades have included the whole range of people who are atheists, agnostics, evangelical Christians, people of Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and the whole range of people. But and that's really what makes us strong, and that's part of our fundamental mission, because we feel like in unity we're going to have a better country. Not everyone feels that way, of course. There's an industry of pundits and organizations who argue that America is a Christian nation. And I mean that with, when I realized when I was writing these that I'd be using a lot of air quotes, but I hope you all know, I'm sure you probably know about this whole concept of Christian nation, capital C, capital N, that's founded by and for a group of Christians that believe that our public policies must be aligned with a particular group of Christians and their particular interpretation of the Bible. Given the kind of Christian nation rhetoric that we have already seen in this political season, we can't say it often enough that in America, one standing in the community and as a political candidate and as a citizen does not, cannot, and must not require any profession of faith. Neither, of course, does it require anybody to abandon their faith. That brings me to one of the major points I'd like to mention today, and I hope that we can have a discussion about, is the importance of recognizing and encouraging and amplifying the voices of religious people who genuinely do value religious liberty and who understand that the separation of church and state is not the enemy of religious liberty, but it's the bedrock of the freedom that we have in this country. People for the American Way Foundation recently hosted a panel at the National Press Club just 2 weeks ago. We had a historian, a lawyer, a religious scholar, and a seminary dean. I know that sounds like a joke, like they all go into a bar, but actually this was at the National Press Club. And they all took on the arguments from a different perspective of this Christian nation crowd. It was a great conversation, and I hope that you'll watch it online. There's a link to the entire session on the People for the American Way blog at pfa.org. But it was interesting, the historian John Ragosta that we had there, he wrote a book about the evangelical Baptists and Presbyterians in Virginia in the late 1700s. And they played a very big part in pushing James Madison and the other founding fathers to resist this Christian nation pressure of their own day. And they stood very strongly as religious people for the separation of church and state. But what is interesting about it, and the historical record is very clear, that those Baptists and Presbyterians weren't just trying to protect themselves from the more powerful established Anglican church in Virginia. They were also very clearly opposed to any kind of establishment of Christianity in general, and they were very explicitly concerned about the potential for government oppression of minority faiths and of non-religious people. And it made us all wonder, and interested to know what you think, how many Americans learn that in their history classes today. We know there are a lot of people that learn from Fox News and the likes of Newt Gingrich and Glenn Beck and David Barton, who push a version of American history and American exceptionalism that is, in my air quotes again for American exceptionalism, that is dangerously divisive and demonstrably false. Anyway, I think it is high time that we took our history back. Another speaker at that event, who was one of our senior fellows, said that if you look at American history, how was progress made? And this person, this senior fellow, is a scholar of social movements, and all of our great moments in social progress have come by people of different religious traditions getting together with people who are not devoted to any religious view. That's how progress was made in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the peace movement, and so on. And it's how, surprisingly, after many years of rough starts, that we're moving towards equality for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender Americans by people working together across lines in order to make that happen. And it's not by any one religious group itself or by atheists themselves, but by people working together across those lines to advance the common good and to promote common values and protect the principles which we're all unified by of the Constitution, on which all of our freedom depends. Building all those kind of alliances for effective action is what we do at People for the American Way, which carries out political and legislative advocacy, and our affiliated foundation, our 501c3, which promotes our values through educational outreach, activist training, and grassroots mobilization all across the country. Anyway, I'd like to take a couple of minutes and talk about some of the work we're doing and then get back to some of the challenges that we face in this current political climate. Everything that we do at our organization is grounded on a set of values and constitutional principles that define what we call the American way. And those include freedom of thought, expression, religion, opportunity and equality under the law, the right to vote, and the importance of a federal judiciary that upholds individual liberty and the protections of all Americans as set forth in the Constitution. Unfortunately, every single one of those things is under attack in America today. One way we work to defend and uphold these principles is by amplifying the impact of individual leaders in order to create individual people that can be champions of the cause, together for mutual support, reinforcement, and skill and issue training. We have a program that we created called Young People For, progressive campus leaders, and provides them with training, mentors, and the opportunity to undertake a social change project. It's a one-year-long program. Many Michiganders have been a part of that. We also have an institute that we call the Frontline Leaders Academy, which takes young progressives and gives them an intensive training institute on the nuts and bolts of making change politically. That could be as a candidate or as a campaign manager, communication director, or field director. And one of my favorite programs that we have is called the Young Elected Officials Network. It was an idea that was started after the 2004 election, and it now includes over 700 elected officials, all under age 35 in all 50 states. It's a very powerful program that allows these people who are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, which is going to really shape our country, and allows them to strategize with their peers and to develop all the skills and expertise and trade ideas. Because often if you're somebody, and I know that you all often work with many groups around when you're the one person in a community that believes a certain way. Well, the great thing about this is that in all 50 states, these people can share ideas and make change across the country. I'm tremendously proud of the impact that these programs are having on young people, and by the steady growth of some of the people who have participated in these programs. There's so many stories. I mean, I always say about the young elected officials that there are 700 of them, and there are 700 stories. One I wanted to share with you is that of Kirsten Sinema. I don't know if any of you know her, but Kirsten was elected as a state representative and then a state senator just in the last election. Even though she is an outspoken critic of the religious right, you can find a great video of Kirsten speaking, and this is in Arizona of all places, which is very important. You can find a great video of Kirsten speaking at the launch of the Secular Coalition for Arizona. She's been honored by the Center of Inquiry for supporting science-based public policy, imagine that, church-state separation, and civil rights. And she's been a part of the Young Elected Officials Network since the very beginning. And I'm proud to say she is now a member of the board, People for the American Way, the national board. And next year, she is probably running for Congress, so you'll be hearing a lot about her, believe me. The other network I want to talk to you about may make some of you bristle a little bit or squirm, and that is our African American Religious Affairs program, which mobilizes African American progressive clergy. The founder of this program is a wonderful man who's on our board, Reverend Tim McDonald of Atlanta, Georgia. He got involved with People for the American Way after watching the religious right advocate trying to build alliances with black clergy by promoting taxpayer-funding vouchers for religious schools. The religious right actively went into African American communities all over the country and said, hey, how would you like millions of dollars to build your own schools, and it's going to be with government money. And that raised alarm among some, particularly Tim, who, since he was a powerful advocate for separation of church and state, he and his colleagues were ones that they don't set aside their religious beliefs, but they believe that public money should be for public use. It was interesting. He started this ministry group, which has grown and grown every year. And it was very interesting. On some of the African American religious community, we didn't agree on very much when it came to choice or gay rights. Or there was very little, but one thing we did agree was on public education. Since then, at the beginning of that program 16 years ago when it was started, has grown into all these other areas. And it's interesting how now I would say we agree on almost on the range of issues that we care about. And I think it's interesting that it's these people's, often their religious beliefs that inspire them to take action, whether that is about LGBT equality, and the way they speak about it is in terms of religion. It's a different way than we speak about it, but it gets to the same place. Because they speak about that, they've become amazing messengers in their community and voices in their community about voting and equality issues. It's interesting, in this next year, the ministers are devoting themselves to dealing with the voter suppression all across this country. As I'm sure you all know, and hopefully you know, yes, hopefully you know that, and it's interesting, in all of our lives, most people in this room, we've seen progress towards more and more people voting. Well, that has turned around in the last 2 years. I hope you know, I hope you've read, I hope you'll do something about the fact that in many states in this country they are trying to turn back the clock with a voter ID, anything they can possibly do to try to limit the number of people voting. And anyway, the ministers next year are devoting most of their work to trying to increase voter participation. And they continue on, which is one of the things I've been most pleased with, which is a conversation that they have had in African American communities challenging issues of sexuality, homophobia, and the dignity and right to equal treatment for LGBT people. And it's interesting how that wedge issue has been used by the right, just like they did with education. And those youth and clergy leadership networks, along with our activists and media outreach and policy advocacy, help us advance our work to fight the right, which is our essential core of our work, promotes justice and equality for all, and to protect that right to vote. Fighting the religious right was what we were created to do. 30 years ago, Norman Lear was watched, and he was horrified by the newly politicized televangelists, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and the like, who claimed ownership of the faith and the flag and patriotism, and argued that you couldn't be a good American unless you were the right kind of Christian, and that you couldn't be the right kind of Christian unless you agreed with their far-right political positions as well. That came along with the package. And if you happen to watch the Republican presidential debate in Iowa that was just before Thanksgiving, or if you're a regular reader of our blog at People for the American Way, you know that some things haven't changed very much in the last 30 years. Religious right leaders as well as presidential candidates are still pushing the notion that America's founders intended this to be a Christian nation. They're rewriting history. And they still imply that only certain kinds of Christians should be leading the country, and still denigrate as both anti-Christian and un-American those who disagree with them. It was actually interesting coming out here of thinking of 30 years ago when Michigan Governor George Romney was running for the Republican presidential nomination. And he was a top-tier candidate. And his Mormon faith was hardly even mentioned. I don't think that many people even knew it. But today his son is running, and he finds that his faith is openly disparaged by religious right figures almost every day. I mean, how far have we come? One thing that has changed is the power and the reach of the right-wing movement in this country. No longer are we talking about a few televangelists that are on a few stations that are pounding their pulpits on the political fringes. Now we're talking about a movement that has spent decades building an enormous infrastructure designed to influence not just religion, but also culture and politics, and to build political power. And at the beginning it seemed that the internet was going to be a wonderful thing for progressives, and they were going to be able to share information and find each other, and the other side might not even know about it, but I think that has changed. They've caught up. The internet means that someone who might have grumbled to himself in a little cabin in the woods somewhere, and only his neighbors knew that he was crazy, can now get a national audience. If that audience grows enough, and if the guy's crazy enough and loud enough, that he might get his own show on Fox. Anyway, hundreds of millions of dollars is in this system. It's not just the airwaves. There are hundreds of millions of dollars that flow in to this on the state and national level, and that's in think tanks and grassroots efforts, what we call astroturf political organizations, ones that are created, falsely, universities, law schools, and electoral operations. Former Christian Coalition Director Ralph Reed and other Republican strategists are working to merge the agendas of all these organizations and organizing energies of the religious right and the Tea Party. And what is new is the right-wing corporate interests. And together combined, that's a very powerful force. And it's not, again, not just ministers and people who follow them. It is now this much more, as Hillary Clinton said, vast right-wing conspiracy. And yet every time a conservative candidate, which is interesting, loses an election, Somebody in the mainstream media declares that the religious right is finished as a political force, and it's all over. And they're always wrong. The movement isn't going anywhere. It has very deep roots and very deep pockets. It has a vast reach, an intense ideological zeal, and the theological certainty that they are doing God's will. I've heard people quote a 17th century writer saying, "I'd rather see coming towards me a whole regiment with drawn swords than one lone Calvinist convinced that he is doing the will of God." Well, we've got lots of regiments of those people convinced that they are doing the will of God, including a visible group of dominionists, and I'm sure you're familiar with that movement, who literally believe that they are commanded to take dominion over every aspect of government and society in order to bring about the second coming of Christ. People for the American Way makes a major investment in monitoring and analyzing the religious right's goals, strategies, tactics, and political alliances. We go to their conferences. We fill our inboxes with their action alerts, of which there are hundreds every day. And we spend hours watching and listening to their broadcasts so you don't have to. And it's interesting how that has changed, and actually we just gave our collection of right-wing things, because we were collecting things when they used to be mimeographed in church basements. And we just gave that collection, which now has become the People for the American Way collection at Berkeley for the study of right-wing movements. And it's interesting because we often had things that people didn't have. And to talk about the technology, a lot of those things were on mimeographed and hand-addressed, stamped things that were going to a few groups. And many of those things, particularly in the anti-choice area, were descended of other things, and these are the only documents that ever existed of these things that are now coming in people's inboxes every day via the internet. Anyway, you can find great day-to-day coverage of what we do, and much of it is very funny, I gotta say. And you can get more in-depth analysis from our series of Right Wing Watch reports, some of which we put back here, but if you go onto our blog, there's some very interesting and funny things, but it's also, of course, scary. We were putting together a collection of things, such as even the last week, Pat Robertson famously asked, and we put this out and it got world coverage, because when they were interviewing Condoleezza Rice and they were asking what does she eat for Thanksgiving, and she said macaroni and cheese, and he said, macaroni and cheese at Thanksgiving, is that a black thing? And there's that, but then there's also the things of people that say so often, and it's amazing that they could even say this, that the First Amendment doesn't cover certain groups of people, that it only covers a certain kind of Christian. It doesn't cover Mormons, it doesn't cover Muslims, it doesn't. And so we monitor this, again, so you don't have to. We've documented the right wing's efforts to undermine the federal judiciary and its commitment to upholding the Constitution. Unfortunately, decades of efforts to push the courts to the right have brought us to the point where on some issues the Supreme Court majority has virtually become one more arm of the right-wing movement. For years, we fought on many issues and thought, well, we'll be defended in the courts. Let's get it to the Supreme Court. We're going to be protected. Well, that has changed. There's now pretty much 5 sure votes that probably will vote against many of the things that people believe in this room, and that has changed. Just 2 years ago, coming up in January, the court declared that corporations have the same rights as citizens to influence our elections. And they're making it harder for individuals to use the courts to hold corporations or government officials accountable, and harder to get access to the courts to protect separation of church and state, as you all probably well know. Meanwhile, Republicans at a recent debate tried to outdo each other in their hostility towards the federal judiciary, arguing that Congress should simply strip the courts of their ability to even weigh in on issues involving church and state separation, marriage equality for same-sex couples, and even in Michelle Bachmann's case, that they should not be involved in anything involved with offshore oil drilling. The attacks on the courts is also an attack on one of People for the American Way's core issues, and that's equality for all. The religious right wants to put in force laws behind their religiously based hostility towards gay and lesbian Americans, but that's not the only group vulnerable to right-wing attacks. Others include immigrants and ethnic and religious minorities. The right wants to achieve these goals by building electoral power, and the real economic suffering that so many are facing in this country creates an opening for demagoguery of all kinds, as we all know. One look at the kinds of people in Congress, state houses, and state legislatures across the country can give you a sense of the success that they've had. They brought in a wave of far-right lawmakers into government at all levels. And these lawmakers are now working overtime to enshrine that power through legislative redistricting and through cynical and shameless efforts to keep minority voters, college students, and others from being able to cast a vote. And I would argue that on the federal level, the Tea Party activists who voted for Republican lawmakers out of their concern that the federal debt was endangering the future of their children and grandchildren, that they've been victims of a bait and switch. They didn't think, in many cases, this was what they'd be getting. Those lawmakers are embracing a no taxes at all costs ideology that's making it impossible to bring down the deficit. In all these areas, People for the American Way and its affiliated foundation work to bring our expertise into effective action. We shape the media coverage with reports that document and analyze attacks on equality, the courts, and voting rights. And we give progressive bloggers and activists and legislators information and ways to act on it. And we're going to have a lot to do in the year ahead. I'm heartened by the fact that our membership has grown dramatically, and I trace it back to August of 2009 when the healthcare, after the healthcare reaction to the healthcare and the growth of the Tea Parties, that the rest of America is also waking up. We just had that debate among almost all the candidates at the hosted by the religious right groups, and the clear implication was that only a certain kind of Christian would make an acceptable presidential candidate. And that was far from the first time we've seen that this season. In August, I spent some of my time in my hometown of Houston, Texas, and that was not for fun, particularly in August in Houston. But as you probably know, Governor Rick Perry essentially launched his presidential campaign with an exclusionary prayer rally, an event organized by many of the country's most extreme purveyors of religious and anti-gay bigotry. We were appalled, the concept that this is the way that one now could launch a campaign with a national prayer rally. And he said it wasn't the launch of his campaign, but it really was.